I will go ahead and introduce you. Thank you all so much for joining our final session of the night, Cultivating Authentic Presence Through Storytelling. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Catherine. A 30-year IT veteran, Catherine is currently working at VMware. She is also the director of the board of an 167-year-old business in New Zealand. Previously, Catherine has held a number of APJ roles with Oracle, IBM, and Telium. She leads a team of over 200 technical resources spread from Japan through to New Zealand. She lives in Sydney, Australia with her wife Nola and dog Moab. She is passionate about being active and embarking on adventures. In 2019, she raced across Tanzania on a mountain bike and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, the world's highest freestanding mountain. Previously, she competed in 6 triathlon world championships, including Kona. And so with that, Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who is joining today for the last session. In the spirit of reconciliation, I want to begin by acknowledging that I am hosting this session from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand today, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. Given the global nature of the conference, I respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all gather today. Welcome to this session on cultivating authentic presence through storytelling. I'm going to have a big shout out to all the sessions that I've seen delivered so far. What an exciting and inspirational day. Now, get your pens out or your Evernote ready or whatever it is that you use to take notes. Expect this to be an actionable session where you will take home some things you might want to actually action. So we're going to start the session by exploring authentic presence and what it is, how to develop it, and how to use the use of storytelling to support it. You can expect to leave this session with motivation for cultivating your authentic presence, 3 practical strategies for how to do that, a framework for enriching your storytelling capabilities, and some inspiration on how you can contribute to joy to the world recovery by leveraging your newly sharpened skills for the good of the community. A little bit about me. I became aware of the power of my own authentic presence in my 20s when I was first introduced to it through a course. 30 years on, I remember the impact of that weekend vividly. It was a revelation to me that I could have the most influence if I was simply present and myself. Even with this knowledge, in my early years, I actually orphaned parts of myself from the process. I would choose to deliver the parts I knew were most recognizable to my audience, which meant core aspects of myself and who I was were left unseen. You can think of it as I left my orphan selves quite simply outside of the room. Throughout my life, I have continued to explore the application of presence, and with it, I have integrated my multifaceted self. One of the things I've learned along the way is that the more I bring myself to a presentation, to the stage, or to a room, the more powerful I become. People want to see themselves reflected in a leader or a presenter. So the more I bring my integrated self into the room, the more likely this is to happen. As I became responsible for teams, it's been about passing on these skills to those people, but it's also about building an environment where the team feels safe to bring their vulnerable and still integrating selves to the table. Telling stories that matter with your whole self has the power to shift perspectives and make a difference in the world. You have the permission to be yourself. It doesn't need to be presented in a prescribed style to be meaningful, to be impactful. As technologists, being able to bring technology to life for all is a very valuable skill and a responsibility that we should all cultivate. Much of what I will talk about today is not original thought, and I can't own it. What we're discussing should be attributed primarily to three people who've greatly influenced my understanding and application of authentic presence and spinning a yarn. I am simply passing on what they generously taught me. First, Amanda Fleming first introduced me to valuing and cultivating an authentic presence in my 20s. It was her course I first attended, and her insight forms the basis of all that I know today. Secondly, Mike Anderson. He's the technical founder of the last organization I worked for, Telium. His ability to translate complex technological advances into easy to consume stories was just quite amazing. And then finally, Simon Sinek, probably a more recognizable character to everyone here. Simon's work on Start With Why and The Infinite Game has highly influenced my philosophy since I was introduced to his Golden Circle video about 8 years ago. Each of us has fundamental influences in our history. They help form how we show up today, and remembering what they taught us can be highly valuable, especially in times of stress, such as presentations. So, your first action of the day, identify your own influencer triad. I urge you to contemplate who you would call out as the people who've most significantly impacted your ability to be present and bring stories to life, and why it is they're so important. Hold this, because it can be a really useful reference point when you have the state wobbles or are unsure of how to proceed. Now, it's an action, but I'm not going to give you the opportunity to actually complete that action given to time restrictions, but I will take you back through all of the actions that I talk about today at the end of the session. So let's just talk a little bit about presence, because I've used this term authentic presence a number of times now, and ultimately it is something that people struggle to know how to describe. What is it? We know it when we see it, and we know it when we feel it, but sometimes it's just really hard to define. It's often described as charisma, confidence, being compelling, and people shrink from that sometimes because it's like, well, those are things that maybe I'm not. Sometimes with people with presence have those characteristics, but not always. Presence is actually about the ability to connect with people and to have influence. For a leader or a presenter, to have impact and presence is essential. It's both a quality and a skill, and as such, it's not something you're born with. It's something that you can develop and you can cultivate. If it's about connection, there's lots of ways each of us can express presence. We can be an introvert or an extrovert. We can be a senior leader or an emerging leader, or in fact, we can not classify ourselves as a leader at all and still project a strong and powerful presence. You'll find I use the word leader a lot throughout this presentation, and maybe you're thinking, I'm not sure I'm a leader. That's okay. The truth of it is, if you're cultivating presence, you become a leader by default. Now, I've got to say up front, this is not about fake it till you make it. Yeah? This is not about tips and techniques. It's about knowing who you are, being able to surface that, and do it authentically. When the things that you say and the things that you do align with the things that you believe, you're congruent. And as humans, we innately sense congruence or authenticity. I don't know about you, but I know for me, I'm drawn to authenticity. When you hold a position of alignment with belief, with what you say and how you act, trust emerges. And trust is the ultimate lubricant in teams and across partnerships. You'll find plenty of tools, tips, tricks on how to model authenticity, but I believe you exhibit the most authenticity when you're in integrity with yourself. But let's face it, when we're under stress, I know the feeling because I felt it when we first started this presentation, you always struggle the most with how to be present. Presenting to a group, doing a job interview, talking to someone you admire or someone who's in a position of power. How do you find a way to be present in those most challenging situations? I want you to think about one of those situations where you've been under pressure and it's been really important to you and you've been challenged to be in the moment. Did you approach it with dread? While you were in it, were you distracted? Did you worry about what people were thinking of you? What should you say next? What did I just say? Did you leave it with a sense of regret, as though you were unseen? What you really want to have happen is you want to approach it with composure, execute it with confidence, and leave with satisfaction. When you can achieve that, when you are in present, you are not only having impact for yourself, you are actually inviting all others who are with you to be present too. You can create and you can hold space for all. As you find your presence and with it your voice, you display an integrated leadership. The more we can integrate and display ourselves, the more we enable others to do the same. So hopefully at this point, you've decided that presence is an important thing and it's something that can be trained and cultivated, and it's something that you're prepared to invest some time and energy into. If that's the case, then I think there are 3 primary areas to focus on that actually can improve how you become more present in your presentations. So the first is actually being aware of the state that you are in and how you want to control it. The second is making connection with the individuals within the audience that you are speaking with. And the third is finding places to play. Places where you can play with storytelling and you can play with presentations. So let's start with the first piece, the state control. Your state is your way of being in a moment. If you're conscious of your state, it is actually something you can intentionally guide. To be in control of your state, there are 3 things you need to be clear about. How do I want to show up? What kind of leader do I want to be? How do I show that and present that to the audience? And then ultimately, how do I want my audience to feel? Once I have the answer to those 3 things, I need to make sure that my actions align with that intention. So your next action to take away from this session is about committing to paper. What kind of leader do I want to be? For me, I would answer this by saying, I want to be authentic. I want to be brave. How do I want to show up? Well, again, for me, it's about energy. It's about movement. It's part of the reason I choose to stand up when I present rather than sitting down. And then finally, but what I believe to be the most important, how do you want your audience to feel? For me, I want my audience to feel seen, to find belonging. So with those 3 things, I then try and use my physicality to bring to action alignment with that intent. So that's about state. The second thing I mentioned was the actual connection with the audience. I come from New Zealand, where there's a Māori proverb that many Kiwis, including myself, hold dear to my heart. He aha me nui o te ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. Ask me what is the most important thing and I will tell you. It is people, it is people, it is people. The same is true when you are present. It is about staying connected to your audience, to the people. Now, for me, that's about being able to look out and see the people, which is a little hard on Zoom. I completely acknowledge that's where cameras on and using chat function is a really important feedback mechanism for being able to create that experience of connection, which is, it's important for the presenter, but it's also really important for the audience. So I would suggest to you, if you're attending a presentation, participation is a really important part to get that energy going. When I'm in the room, I'm looking to see, are people leaning in, leaning out? What sounds can I hear? The lean in, lean out, if I've got chat, is also about, am I seeing the chat lean in or lean out? It's the same thing, just in a different medium. As I say, I acknowledge that Zoom is a new medium, that even after 2 years, we are still only just starting to understand how we can build connection across it. But I certainly have seen, as I've moved forward, improvement in that for me. And then last piece, places to play. Ultimately, you want to find play in presentation. You want to find that playful, childlike place, because that's when you will be the most effective. So there are 2 ways to think of this focal point. The first is probably the most obvious. Always be on the lookout for places where you can practice presence and storytelling. It's ultimately why I'm here today, is because whenever I get presented with an opportunity, I will put my hand up. In our business just recently, there was an opportunity. They organised these things called storytelling around a virtual campfire. And of course, I was the first person to put my hand up. It was practicing, speaking without notes. I found it hugely challenging. I picked a topic that was hugely challenging, but ultimately I know it's to my advantage to find places to be uncomfortable and get comfortable with that. The part of the reason I do that is it means that when I get to a big presentation, when I've got a big work presentation, one, quite often I've got content that I've already prepared and I've tested. 2, I find it less daunting and I have more skills. The second way to consider the actual places to play piece is to be playing with presence and playing with the story to see how best it fits with you. Never lose play from your presentation. If you've lost play, then possibly you've lost the point. I'm hoping most people here know who this person is. Steve was renowned as being a great storyteller, but I understand he actually wasn't always that way. He had, apparently, his pitch for the Lisa computer, which was one of his earlier computers, was a bit of a flop. It was way too much information and not enough grab. The reason I call that out is even the people that we see today who have a reputation as being great storytellers, it doesn't mean they've always been that way. They've crafted that over time. Storytelling is a strategic business skill that comes from practice, not from birth. Great stories build relationships and make people care because our brains actually actively participate during storytelling. One of the challenges, though, with storytelling is knowing where to start and the stories to tell. So there's a hesitation as to, how do I practice this? I'm nervous. How do I get that done? One of the things that most good storytellers carry is a virtual briefcase of some standard stories that they need to be able to call up on demand. And you will hear them run those stories more than once. Yeah. The first are a set of personal stories. They are, where did I come from? Where am I going? What is my just cause? What's my technical heritage story? And then there are work-specific stories. Having a story that presents the case for why change is needed, because ultimately we all need that story because change is always needed. Being able to talk about a customer, being able to put it in a customer context is always an important story to tell. As a technologist, being able to say what you believe from a technological perspective is a really important story to have in your pocket. And then ultimately your professional motivation. Now, just understand, this is not a definitive list. your briefcase will grow well past these stories. But this is a set of stories that you can start with to start filling the briefcase. Once you start to fill your briefcase, you will find it fills more quickly as time goes on. So let's start with the first story. Now, for some of you, you may already have a why or origin story. And the truth of it is it's a story that probably won't change through your life, but how you tell that story may change. So the why or origin story is about where you come from and how that influences your personal motivation today. I would suggest that when you're trying to craft your origin story, and I should have said before, if you've already got an origin story and you're really happy with it, this process works exactly the same for all of the other stories that I've mentioned in the briefcase. But I'm just going to focus on the origin story today. If you've got someone you trust, it works better if you've got somebody to bounce up against. That is not to say if you don't have that person, that you can't walk through this process on your own. But as I say, if you've got somebody that you can trust to actually give you feedback, it does give you another dimension. Start by looking at your past and actually assess what are the standout memories that you can remember. Be specific. Once you've got those standout memories, start looking for recurring themes and patterns that exist through those. Where are the connections in all of those stories? And how did one standout memory influence the next? Now, when you do this process, I have no doubt, because I've never seen it work any other way, you will end up with more content than you will ever be able to use. And sometimes with stories, you need to cut it down. So what you want to do is take all of the content, all of the potential story, and you want to cut it down to 3 or 4 of the most significant stories, max. Yeah, and sometimes that takes a bit to do that cut down process, but it's important that you don't overload the story. Use these to draft your origin story. Now, when you're drafting an origin story, I'm not going to talk about how do you structure or what framework do you use to craft the story. I've popped up a couple of frameworks that is quite simple frameworks that you can use to actually craft the structure of the actual story. There are lots of different frameworks on the internet. But the things I will say is it doesn't need to be complex. In fact, I'd encourage you to keep it simple, at least to begin with. And play with how it's delivered, yeah? And then once you have it, so you have cut it down, you've put it into a framework, ultimately, you need to deliver it. So practice, practice, practice. You want to start by actually moving yourself through a spectrum of comfort, yeah? So that's why once you have it in a structure, what you're going to do is walk yourself from comfortable to uncomfortable. And through each step, you're going to get feedback. And ultimately, most of the time when you deliver an origin story, there will be an element of uncomfortability. So practicing that now is really useful. So start by delivering it to someone you trust, and then move on to getting feedback back from yourself. So deliver it to someone you trust, get feedback from them. Record it for yourself. Watch it. By the way, this is the one I find the most difficult to do. I don't mind getting feedback from other people. I hate giving myself feedback. Finish by delivering to someone you respect, or who's somebody who's in a position of power, but that is in a position of power with you, but that you trust. The truth of it is that final one will also probably be quite uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. If you can do this, then you're ready to take that story to the world. Once you do take the story to the world, expect that it will naturally evolve, and what you deliver the first time won't be what you deliver the next time. That is the craft of storytelling, is that they don't stay the same, they move on, they live. So, next action. I want you to make a commitment now that you will take these steps to either capture your origin story if you don't have it, or pick another one from the storytelling briefcase. And then from now until, I'm not going to make you do it to the end of this weekend, but the end of next weekend, you are going to have crafted it and you will have delivered it 3 times. Now, that's quite an ask, but if you leave it longer, well, maybe I should own this. If I left it longer, I would procrastinate. So I encourage you to make a commitment, set a timeline as to how long it will take you to deliver it 3 times, so that when you're called upon to do it in the world, you're ready. So it's not about what you say. It's about how you make people feel that's really important. As storytellers, we have a remarkable privilege to use our skills to bring joy. This final exercise is to take it outside of a technological delivery. I would suggest that being able to actually tell a story of joy in the world is, 1, a great gift, and 2, will be a definite place where you can play. Now, if you'd like to tell a technological story of joy, that's also fine. But I want you to use the same process that I've just talked through to craft another story, to craft one that its only purpose is to bring joy. An example of what you might do is actually craft a story for children and then go tell it in a children's hospital, or a joy story and take it to an aged care home. What you're playing with here is not the content, but the connection. And I urge everybody here to consider putting that as an action on their list. It's not a professional piece particularly, but it is something that I think you might be quite surprised by the outcome of actually following that process through. So we started by exploring authentic presence, and we've come all the way to the end with 4 actions. I suggest you identify people in your history who have modeled presence and storytelling for you. Identify why that's important. Next is your presence challenge. Write down how you want to show up when you are presenting, how you want your audience to feel, and how do you want your state to be. Then write a set of actions that will enable you to align your intention with your outcome. Second, add 1 more story to your storytelling briefcase. If you don't have any, start with the why origin story. And then the last task is find a place to play where you can use your skills to bring joy to the world. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Sorry, I was joining back. Thank you so much, Catherine, for your presentation. There was a question earlier in the chat, and then for folks, we have a few minutes for Q&A. So if you have any other questions, just feel free to go ahead and drop those in the chat now. We have a question of, do you have any favorite resources that you would recommend?
For me, I think my resources, well, I've called out people like Simon Sinek. So there are various people that I read or listen a lot to. Brené Brown is another one that I would call out as somebody that I look to for inspiration. In terms of the storytelling, etc., I try and find places within my work that trigger me to actually move forward with the next thing. Because ultimately, if I don't interweave it with work for the most part, I probably don't have the time or the focus to actually get it done. So I'm always on the, in terms of where do I look for inspiration, I'm always on the lookout at work as to where I can find new places to play. And then once I've committed to that, that tends to generate all of the background work that I need to do, and it gives me enforced deadlines to actually achieve those things.
We had some more questions come in. Mackenzie asked, is it possible to see the briefcase slide again and talk about some of those prompts again, just generally?
Yeah, okay, so if we just click back to the briefcase slide. So is this the slide that you were wanting to see? So ultimately I'm saying start with seven stories that you want to slide into your briefcase. Ultimately, first is my why story. So where do I come from and how does that impact my motivation today? I should differentiate between the why story and the just cause story, yeah? So why tends to be a backward-looking thing. It's like, how has my life influenced my motivation today? My just cause or my vision is about where do I think I'm taking my life and why? What is my just cause? I generally think that, if within your working life you can find a reason that is bigger than business and bigger than yourself as an individual, that is the thing that will find you motivation. So just cause is about future, why is about past. Technical heritage, that is more being able to encapsulate all of the things that make you the technical expert that you are today and I try and keep this one short. It's like elevator pitch type. How do I ensure what could be a very long story is encapsulated down into something that is short but punchy and gets people's attention? Change, I just think everybody should have a case for change story. Because ultimately, as the world has definitely demonstrated recently, change is just this constant. And I know that's such a cliche comment, but being able to present a case for technological change is something that I think we should all have in our back pocket. Now, that will depend on the kind of technologies that you're deeply involved with, but all of them are just, in 30 years, none of the technologies I was working with when I first started, assembly language, Pascal, base, those things, all gone. And I've seen, multiple cycles of new things. Customer story, I think being able to bring context to technology from a customer story. Most people love customer stories because they can understand them, they can touch them, they can feel them. I think everybody has an I believe story, by the way, but as a technologist, actually saying what you believe and how that relates to why you're a technologist is an important story to be able to tell. And it's a great hook to be able to actually get people's attention. I just think it's a thing to have. And then professional motivation. I think as women, since I'm going to make an assumption that most people on the line are women, I think being able to clearly articulate or tell a story about your professional motivation is a really useful story to have. And I think it's one we hesitate to actually claim. And so I would suggest actually spending some time about, being prepared to claim your motivation and your professional expertise is an important thing to have in your storytelling list. Did that answer that question? Do we think?
Yes, Mackenzie said, thank you so much.
No problem.
Another question. How do you go about regaining presence when you are mid-presentation and you get internally agitated, overly nervous?
Oh, don't you like that one? I think tell the truth. So there are times where I lose my state. Something happens, or I just, sometimes the whole story, wherever I am, just goes from my head. And by the way, that gets worse as you get older. It didn't used to happen to me in quite the same way. being able to actually call it out, be authentic, and say, I've lost my train of thought. Am I going to get it back? No, it's not coming back. Right, we're moving on. Yeah. So take the audience with you. Don't try and hide it. I mentioned really early on that, you know, people want to see themselves in the person that they're printing. You know, they want to make a connection. Everybody knows that feeling of losing track, of losing state. So call it out. Don't be afraid to. You'll probably take more of the audience with you. And if it really, you know, turns to custard, have you ever noticed people generally have a glass of water somewhere or something? If you've lost your state, do something to change that panic. And grabbing for a glass and just saying, oh, I'm just that course, I'm going to take a sip of water, can often be enough to get you back on track. Yeah. Those would be the suggestions I would have.
Those are great suggestions. I also love Kimberly's comment. Admitting to the feeling definitely adds authenticity. We are all human and we can all relate.
And the other thing I'll say here is I think females present differently from males. Yeah. And I think there's also cultural differences too. I work across the APAC region, so I think I would see people from my China team, for example, present differently than people from my ANZ team. Our standards may have been set by the majority in which we work. Yeah, so I'm sure everybody here probably is, you know, unless you're in a very unusual business, as a female, you're probably in a smaller group than the males around you. So the standard processes or the systemic processes are very much aligned to the men. Yeah. Now that's not a bad thing. That's just the reality of it. But we actually have to set our own standards as well. And I think women and being real and being authentic and not worrying about if it's not perfect is all very female traits. And I think the only way we set those agendas is by actually owning it and being able to be authentic and accepting that sometimes things don't go quite to plan. I think we should be setting the agenda on that.
Yeah. Another question, how do you handle disengaged or uninterested audiences?
Oh,
they brought the good questions.
Yeah, these are great questions. It will depend. It depends. Yeah. So if you feel comfortable enough to do this, I would again inclined to be honest. So if I am getting the read of the audience that they are not engaged, then either what we're talking about is being pitched wrong, or it's actually got nothing to do with what I'm doing, and I'm telling myself a story about what's going on. So ultimately, I think the best thing to possibly do is to stop and say, right, okay, my feeling is, or the story I'm telling myself right now is, you have no interest in this presentation. I'd be really interested to know why did you walk in the room? Yeah. Now it depends on the size of the audience. If you've got 5,000 people, that might be a difficult question to ask. But if you're in a smaller room, understanding because they've walked in the room. There was a reason they're here. Now, that might be because they were told they had to be here. But there is still you should still have an opportunity to make a valuable connection with these individuals and potentially find a different way to have the conversation that actually is productive for everybody. So opening up that conversation and being prepared to hear the answer. You have to be brave, because you could hear an answer you don't want the answer to. But what's the worst case scenario? Put a line through the presentation and stop. But I will bet you if people have walked into the room, there is a reason they're there. And it is actually about finding out what that reason is. It is also, something could have happened, depending on where this group has come from. You don't know what the meeting was before. Yeah? There could have been some, I don't know, someone, their manager's just resigned. And they've walked from hearing that into the meeting that you're now presenting to. Being able to actually unpack that for a little bit and then get back on track, you're probably going to have a far more productive meeting. Yeah?
Yeah, I think that's so true. Especially not knowing where people's mental state is and why they aren't engaged in that particular moment, and that it might not be tied to your actual content and materials is an important thing to keep in mind in those sorts of things. And not to I know I have the tendency to blame myself if I think that people look bored in my talk.
Yeah, and that is a natural, so you're in a vulnerable state. Whenever you're up presenting, you're vulnerable. By definition, by standing up, you put yourself in a vulnerable state. And that means that whatever your natural inclination when you are vulnerable, your natural response, that will be the story you tell yourself about what is going on in the room. But that does not mean that is what is going on. So seek clarification on that, because it is highly likely that it partly is your own response that is happening in that. That story I tell myself, that is a Brené Brown thing, by the way. She's great with that. She's like, don't always think that what you think is going on is what is actually going on.
I think this feeds into a question that just popped up, which is, how do you address self-judgment? I think we might be tough to be a tough judge on ourselves. What are your thoughts? What thoughts do you keep in mind to be kind to yourself when you are revising your presentations?
That's part of the reason I say first present the story to someone you trust, because someone you trust probably is going to be fairer on you than you are. Yeah, they are going to give you a more even measure. So that's why quite often I will not watch recordings of my presentations. I can't stand it. And I am harsh. Yeah. So first, be aware that that is something that most of us probably tend to do. I try to, if I know I'm going down that track, it's like, hold on, what if this was somebody who worked for me and I was having the same conversation? How would I view this presentation? What would I look for? So if I'm working with somebody in my team who's practicing this sort of thing, the first thing I would look for is, okay, what works? Yeah. I'll also look for where can things be improved, because I think that's my job, is to actually not only help people understand where they're working really well, but also to be able to improve and move on. Now, if I'm prepared to do that for the people who work for me, or in my orders, I should be prepared to do the same for myself. But you do have to step back a little bit and turn off the I think there's perfection and then there's excellence. Yeah, perfection is something that I think, well, for me, I've held on to when I was younger. Perfection doesn't exist, especially in presentations. It's live, things happen. Striving for excellence, so putting perfection down and letting it go, and striving for excellence and improvement. Those are things you can work with. Perfection you can't work. You won't. That's an unattainable goal. So actually learning that perfection doesn't serve us, and to let it go is actually really good. I see someone saying improv in facilitation. I think I'm not quite sure. It's really anxiety causing for me. I thought you were suggesting doing improv. I would agree. Doing improv is a really good thing to do, because you've got to think on your feet. Improv and facilitating. So where you actually have to facilitate a group, and especially if you weren't prepared for that process, yes, I agree that can be quite a stretch. I'm also going to say, though, how often have you had the opportunity to practice? So it's, again, I would say improv facilitation is a skill that you have to give yourself a little bit of, give yourself a bit of grace. It's not something, people who can step into a room and facilitate a meeting with no preparation have probably done it many, many times. And you look at it and you go, how come I can't do that? Well, that's because you don't have the skill. There's one briefcase called storytelling. There's another briefcase called facilitation, because it's a different set of skills. I would say, though, that the whole framework, finding places to play, how do I want to be in a facilitation state, all of those things I think apply for facilitation as well. But taking the opportunities when they present is really important, especially if, ultimately you want to go up. But, so I've gone from individual contributor. I now got about 200 people across a geographic span. Those things happened over time. And I have been privileged to have many opportunities to kind of craft those skills. I'm still crafting them, by the way. I will never stop. So don't expect that there is this perfect where, okay, I get to this point and I can just relax. Doesn't happen. It's that story.
I think that is all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much, Catherine, for giving such thoughtful answers for all these heavy-hitting questions. I will also shamelessly plug Women Who Code and say, if you want to work on your facilitation skills, we are always looking for volunteers to help us host the events that we have year round. So if that's something you want to work on, you're like, all of our networks are looking for volunteers for that sort of thing.
Well, that's a great place to practice.
Indeed. I also just sent a link looking for just feedback on the event as a whole for Women Who Code. So we'd really appreciate if everyone filled that out. And again, Catherine, thank you so much for presenting and such thoughtful answers today.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. It's been a fantastic 12 hours or however many hours it's been. Thank you for everyone who's turned up.
13 hours.
13 hours. Yeah. Time to go have a drink.
I think our closing statements are on the main stage right now, so I'd encourage you all to jump over to that part of the Connect conference. And again, thank you so much for attending this session.
Thank you, everyone.